Hey there, welcome back. Business 101, Introduction to Business. And we are continuing on our journey through material from Chapter 9 in the textbook. And in this video, video number 6, we are now looking at the topic of leadership substitutes and neutralizers. What are we talking about? Leadership substitutes and neutralizers. It's an interesting small side topic to our discussion on leadership, but it does bear some attention. So, as you can see in this next slide, we define leadership substitutes as individual, task, and organizational characteristics that tend to outweigh the need for a leader to initiate or direct employee performance. So that's an interesting set of concepts. In other words, are there some occasions or situations where a leader really doesn't need to take control, really doesn't need to direct employees what to do and what sequence, doesn't need to perhaps monitor and hover over whether processes are being taken care of? And in some senses, you look at that first bullet point and say, well, isn't that simply not micromanaging someone? But it means something significantly more and distinct from simply not micromanaging. We're talking about actual factors and characteristics, as you can see there, that tend to outweigh on a regular basis the need for a leader to have hands-on initiation or direction. Now, that is something different than the second bullet point we call leadership neutralizers. And you can see the definition there, factors that may render leader behaviors ineffective. Now, my note here is that leadership neutralizers are always a negative. It's not a positive thing. In other words, in most cases, a leader is trying to do something good, beneficial, and necessary, but negative neutralizer factors come in to counteract or belay or render impotent those effects to actually lead others. So let me see if we can give you sort of a laundry list of these things in the next slide, which is a duplication of a table from the textbook. You can see here table 9.1 from the text, leadership substitutes and neutralizers. And just from the outset, the things that I've highlighted in red are recognized as neutralizers to leadership behavior, whereas those that are simply in black are typically substitutes for leadership and not necessarily neutralizers. So let's take it from the top. Some individual factors. If individuals are highly trained professionals to begin with, it may provide a necessary substitute for immediate hands-on leaders to initiate and direct activity. As well, and tightly related to that, the second bullet point, if individuals have a high degree of ability, knowledge, and motivation in and of themselves, then they may be self-actualized, self-activated, and self-initiating, so they don't need as much direction or initiation from external leaders. Same thing, again, individual experience and training. It's another third individual factor, somewhat related to the first two, which would substitute for the need to have leaders directing activity. Now I see the fourth one there in the list is in red, and that means that it is a neutralizer, always a negative. If the rewards or goals that are put forth by leaders as motivating incentives, if an individual is simply indifferent to those things, then it will neutralize and blunt the attempt of a leader to mobilize his employees, his followers, with suitable rewards. Perhaps then the leader has to select a different reward which has greater attraction and resonance with a particular individual, but I think you can understand how that's distinctly different than the other first three individual factors on that list. Let's move then to job factors. When the job itself is very, very structured and perhaps highly automated, that will tend to substitute for the need to have constant leader intervention. However, the second bullet point there, if the job is highly controlled already, then any attempts to direct outside of that pre-programmed control would be neutralized in that negative sense. And there may be some times when a leader has to try to change the procedure, but because people are so highly ingrained with the way we've always done things, that blunts and neutralizes the attempt of the leader to make necessary changes. Other job factors: if the individuals or the workers find the job intrinsically satisfying, they're already satisfied by it, then leaders don't need to try to motivate people to get on top of finding purpose and those kinds of things. They're already there. That's the reason why they already got into that line of work. And then, of course, if there's already feedback embedded in the job itself, well then, hey, leaders don't necessarily have to remind folks to seek after metrics for their performance. For instance, think of someone who is a professional auctioneer. He's got that really fast, hey, I got a 5 right now, those kinds of things, right? And he or she would be able to get immediate feedback from the average sales price of auctioned items that he was the auctioneer for, he or she, to get immediate feedback whether or not he's performing at an acceptable level or not. A leader may not have to step in and say, hey, have you really considered how effective you are at getting the highest price per item? I hope that makes sense. Some organizational factors. The next set of bullet points you see there, if the organization already has explicit plans and goals, perhaps published by the mission statement and working right down, right, then a leader doesn't need to remind the troops of those things. Everyone already knows it because it's so explicit in that particular organization. Whereas you see the next 3 items really are neutralizers. They are negative things. If perhaps the system itself in the organization is so rigid and unbendable that any attempts for leaders to make a change, holy smokes, right, met with rigid structure already built into the organization. And then finally, if there's a great deal of physical distance between the supervisor and the subordinate, for instance, in distance employment, remote work from home employment, that can neutralize the attempt of a leader to provide some sort of accountability, either for time or for the type or the amount of work done, right? Just merely the physical distance makes it more difficult to lead people when they're far away from you. You can see there then the last group, the 4th group of factors, all of them leadership substitutes: group performance norms, high level of group cohesiveness, group interdependence. These are all factors we will talk about in a little more detail when we talk about work groups. But suffice to say for now, if you are the leader of a group and that group already has very, very high performance norms, in other words, they normally deliver extraordinary performance, as a leader, you may find it's very difficult to get them to change that, if for some reason you wanted to change it, right? Because it's already self-reinforcing. They already have a high benchmark in and of themselves as a work group. And if the group as individuals tends to be really tight, really cohesive, they like each other, they get along, they have a long history of defending each other, that's very hard to disrupt and break. And here's the thing. That's a wonderful thing if that group is already performing at a high level. It is really tough to manage and lead if the group is highly cohesive and has a history of very low performance. It's really hard when you're dealing with a cohesive group that's poor performing to get them to elevate their performance. Why is that? I think you can guess. Because everybody's got each other's back. Nobody's going to drive anybody else higher than the established norm. It's really difficult for them to get to change. And then finally, if the group members are dependent on each other, which sort of speaks to group cohesiveness, although it is a distinct item, right? That group interdependence, high levels of that will in and of itself substitute for a leader needing to talk about cooperation, talking about working together and those kinds of things, perhaps because the very nature of the role itself already exposes if someone wants to go rogue or work as a lone wolf. Now, let's see if we can give 2 obvious examples of work situations where perhaps many, if not all of these factors play into substituting for the need for leadership. And I've got 2 illustrated in this slide before you, right? When someone goes into an emergency room because broken arm or bleeding head wound or something like that. There isn't a leader in the emergency room who says, okay, now everybody get up off the chair. You doctors, suit up. You nurses, where's the admitting nurse, right? There is already a process in place with highly trained professionals so that when someone walks in, the system kicks in, professionalism kicks in, and there isn't a need, in other words, the need for a direct in-place leader is substituted by very high degrees of competency, experience, a system in place, training, very high levels of professionalism. I hope that makes sense. And the same is true, of course, with firefighters. You see the illustration on the right. Consider this for a moment. The next time that the bell goes off in the firehouse, will those firefighters be still sitting in their bunks while the bell goes off, waiting for the fire captain to come out of his door and say, okay, fellas, time to get out of bed. Don't forget to put your socks on. Hey, who's number one to go down the shiny pole? Don't forget to put your overalls on first, right? No, because they're highly trained, they're professionals, they know what their role is. The group knows that they're interdependent on each other to do each one to do their role and job, and therefore that substitutes for the need to have direct, hands-on, step-by-step instruction, management, and leadership. And that's really sort of the spirit of what we're talking about in this topic. When we talk about substitutes, and in some bad cases neutralizers, but generally substitutes for direct leadership, we're really talking about, generally speaking, highly competent, trained, professional individuals who simply surpass the need to have direct hands-on leadership in their midst. Hope that makes sense. We'll see you in the next lecture.